So Ben's, we're very lucky to have Ben. He's a senior lecturer from the University of Southampton in the UK. And we're incredibly lucky to have him here with us for 2 years under an EU fellowship called the Marie
Skłodowska-Curie.
Marie Curie Fellowship, which pays for him to come here and play for 2 years essentially and then go back to the UK. But he's playing with serious intent and contributing in all sorts of ways to the centre, even though he's only been here, what, 6 weeks, 2 months?
Yeah.
2 months, yeah. So anyway, I'm going to be enthralled to hear the success story this time. It probably won't be quite so popular as the favorite story, but anyway, thank you, Ben.
No problem.
And look forward to it.
Great. Well, I can actually share a little bit of what went wrong last time and then how we fixed it, because obviously that's what you really want to hear is what we're doing. So, very long title. I'll explain all about it as we go through. And it's focused around one particular problem, which we call flexibility. And I'll explain what that is in a minute. And then I'm going to explain what we do and don't know about this concept, this idea, particularly in electricity consumption, energy demand in the UK, but also internationally. I'll talk about how we've gone about studying it, which is this bit here, SAVE project. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the initial results that we got out of it. This project itself, as you'll see, is quite a long one. I've had to leave it in good hands to come here for 2 years. It's finishing about a month before I get back. So I will have nothing to do with it after that. The timing didn't really quite go according to plan, but there we go. And then I'll explain at the end what we've learned, and partly that's how we fixed the problems we had, but also some of the other stuff. So just to set the scene, the context, if you like, this is a picture of consumer household residential demand in the UK from about 2011, done by essentially wiring up whole circuits to see what makes up the consumption patterns. This is something that you will see here too. It's not unusual for most Western developed countries. You get this evening peak over here when people get back from work or school or whatever, turn stuff on, particularly in the lower latitudes, whichever. When it gets dark in winter, lighting plays a big role up here as well. And you can see that the problem is, if you're a network engineer, you've got to design your network to cope with that, but some of the time it's way down here. So there's this massive inefficiency going on here. And also in the UK at the moment, we're struggling because we've got an aging network, so that things start to fall over here, particularly at the local scale. So that the national network doesn't have a problem with this particularly, and they've got to engineer things to cope with it. But in local networks, if everybody comes home in the street, starts turning stuff on, things overheat, things start to trip out. So we have an issue with trying to sort it out. In the UK, supplying this power at the moment is very carbon intensive, so it's coal or gas. Here you use hydro, as I understand it, but with the climate changes that you're seeing, reductions in hydro capacity potentially could be an issue. And the other thing about that kind of power is that it's very expensive power. So switching on underutilized gas, or in our case coal power stations, is not an efficient way to supply that power. So we have inefficiencies and we have overload here. We're also starting to see in some areas export overload. So in other words, PV generation here in the middle of the day is starting to reduce the voltage in the network. Well, it's actually starting to increase the voltage in a very local networks, and they weren't designed that way. They were designed to cascade downwards. Okay, so this is certainly a significant problem here in the UK. Essentially, we've got a set of problems, and the elephant in the room, really, for us, is what happens when you stick renewables into the mixture. Because for a start, sun doesn't shine here this time of day. Wind blows kind of when it wants to blow. And in effect, what you'd like to do is to fill something up here so that it can just essentially flatten everything as far as you can through the day, because that would be a much more efficient way to run your network. When you've got intermittent supplies, you have to worry about what to do. So what can we do about it? Well, obviously part of that is about reducing this here, just bringing the head down. It's also about shifting it, if you can, and it's about, ideally, stopping that off and sticking it in there, which is where storage comes in. Now, the various mechanisms of doing that, but also one of the things that we're most interested in is the idea of flexibility, and this really is about shifting peak load. Okay, so these activities, practices that people have using these appliances that generate this peak are done at this time of day for all sorts of very good reasons and potentially difficult to move around. But then again, there may be some things that can move around. okay, because this is only how it is at the moment. Historically, this has not looked like that. In the future, for all kinds of social transition reasons, it may not look like that either. So this is dynamic. This can change, and it can be changed, therefore. Okay. And that's what we mean by flexibility. Can we move that around? Do people, households in this case, but also industrial users, which is outside the scope of what I'm going to talk about, but it's another big part of the picture. What can industrial users do to shift their demand around to better match intermittent supply in particular? Okay, so what do we know about how we can shift stuff around? Well, before we talk about what do we know, I just want to step back a little bit and ask ourselves what kind of evidence, not what's the evidence, but what kind of evidence we have for whether people can shift their behaviour in this particular context of flexibility. Okay, and there's three things I want to focus on here, which are incredibly important. The first is, in the studies that people have done, have we had a large enough sample size so that we can actually robustly conclude that that effect they're telling us is actually there? So, for example, if they saw a 6% reduction in something, and if they only had 100 people, that could have been just random. Okay. Have we got sufficiently sized studies to actually robustly conclude what we think is there? Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing that's incredibly important, but sort of combined, is are they randomly selected? So that's quite crucial for various statistical methods. But also, are they representative of the population we care about? So it's relatively easy to get eco-warriors who just put PV on their roof, etc., to sign up to a study, trial. But what does that tell you about the British population as a whole, or the New Zealand population as a whole? Roughly nothing. So we have to think about the kinds of samples that we want for the populations that we want to talk about. So if we want to talk about flexibility for the whole customer base of New Zealand, that implies we need a representative sample from New Zealand, not just the ones we can sign up quickly and easily because they want to take part. Okay, so self-selection really doesn't work. And the third thing that's really important here is that we do some sort of randomization process once we've got that representative sample into our different groups. We ideally want a control group, and we want some other groups that we're going to do stuff to. And they need to be randomly allocated. So in principle, if the numbers are big enough, we can assume there's no difference between them. That's the key aspect of a randomized control trial. So the other way of doing it is to follow people, let's say over 1 year, measure them, do something, measure them again, have things changed. And that's great. That works really well, but not in this context. The reason it doesn't work very well in this context is because if you want to do something about winter, you've got to be measuring them the winter before. And you've also got to make sure that any changes you see aren't to do with people leaving the home, new appliances, something changing in the environment. Is it a colder, wetter, drier? Okay. So a longitudinal study like that is incredibly difficult to do in this particular context. It's much better to run a control group and your intervention groups in parallel because you know they've experienced the same environmental features. Okay. And you use the randomization to say, well, there's no real difference between them other than what I'm doing to them. Okay, so three key things. I'm going to come back to those. So what we've done is to go back over the literature on, I've called them here demand response trials, but it's the same thing. It's about demand flexibility. There's been quite a number of them, over 30 actually, 30 major ones published. And Tom here, he did most of the legwork, most of the reading work as well. And I'll just show you what Tom essentially concluded. Out of all of that lot, there's one, just one, that ticks those three boxes. And that was run by the Irish energy regulator, actually, in the Republic of Ireland, in about 2011. And they did it pretty much spot on for those three things. It was a large enough sample, it was representative of the population, and they randomized their control group and their intervention groups. Okay? So they did a good study. So, in other words, what do we know? Well, we do know a bit. Okay, I would lie if I didn't say nothing. We do know a bit, but because most of the samples are not representative, we can't generalize to the populations. Because most of them are too small, we can't actually conclude that the effects of the claim are really there. It could be just down to random chance. Okay, so you can probably imagine that what I'm going to tell you now is how we went about fixing this problem, okay, how we responded to this. So that's the next part of the talk. But before I do that, have I got any questions on where we've got to so far? Everybody with me, everybody agrees that this is a really good thing we have to do. Okay, so the SAVE project, acronym, it's quite a large funded project in the UK. And what we wanted to do was to investigate two things that have essentially been kind of done before and one that haven't. The first one was if you communicate with people, try and persuade them, can you get them to reduce their demand? The second one, this is just in the evening peak 4 to 8 period. Okay? The second one, if you do all of that and you give them a price incentive, do they respond a bit better? Okay, so you could make it more expensive, for example, or in this case, we actually did a prize. If you could reduce, you got a prize over a period of time. And this one has not been done before, as far as we know. And that was essentially going around to every household in that group and replacing their LED light bulb. Replacing their light bulbs in the kitchens and main living rooms with LEDs. Okay, so that was, as you can imagine, quite an expensive undertaking to do. And I'm not going to talk about that one because that's still running at the moment. So I'm just going to focus on the first two. So before we go any further, let's just go back to what I just said. We need to have this to be statistically robust. We want to be able to make the claims. So it's got to be random sample and it's got to be large enough. What's large enough? Well, I'll explain how we decide what's large enough in a minute. It also needs to be generalisable, so it has to be representative, and I'll explain how we went about doing that. And we also need to have it as an RCT approach, so we randomly allocated once we've got our representative sample. Okay, so we're lining up those three key things. So what's large enough? So this is a graph of statistical power. But basically what it tells you is, for a given sample size, how big an effect you can detect robustly, statistically, okay, given certain assumptions. Yeah, so I don't particularly want to go into now, but I can if you like. And it uses that Irish smart meter data, because that's the only good one there was at the time. So you can, if you remember, I said we thought we'd get about 6% in those first two trial conditions. So that meant we needed a sample size in each of those groups of about 1,000 people. Okay. If we had it less than that, if we only recruited 800 or 600, our intervention is going to have to do a lot more work, okay, before we can robustly detect it under these assumptions. And those are standard best practice assumptions. You could relax some of them, but then your chances of concluding wrongly are higher. Okay, that's type 1, type 2 errors, which I won't go into now either. But
just quickly, does that line, if you keep going up in terms of thousands of participants, does it sort of reach an asymptote?
It stops declining somewhere over here. So
you've got everybody in the population.
If you thought it was only 4%, which a lot of the time of use tariff trials have suggested 4%, then I think you probably needed about 4,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
If you was only, well, I mean, some things it's not worth getting out of bed for, right? Just don't even try it.
Mm.
So it's really crucial, and this is a big message that has to go back to funding sources too. That if you have no evidence that you can get something in this region, and you don't have the money to fund this kind of level, forget it. Just don't do it. Don't waste your money. I had said that to the funders of this whole program because they funded a number of studies before, and they went, "Oh, so those ones we've just done, yeah, well, never mind. Let's move on." So the recruitment process, we wanted to, for various complicated reasons, so UK, water, Europe, UK, anyway, that region there is the area that we focused on. And that's because the, we call them DNOs, but the Lines company that we're working with has, this is their patch. They are Scottish and Southern, Scotland and Southern. Not Scotland or Southern. Anyway, that's the patch. So that was how we selected the general boundary. And then we used a process which is called stratified address-based sampling, basically to randomly select addresses within census areas. So in your case, that would be a mesh block that you would have. So there's a process you can go through, and that's market research best practice, essentially. And then we sent a letter out to those selected addresses, and then we sent around the research agency staff. And we sent out about 32,000 letters, and we got about a 12% response rate, which is fairly normal for this kind of approach. Okay? You can imagine that's quite expensive. It cost about £100, so roughly $200 per household. We've got 4,000 households, so it's quite a lot. Don't think of the cost, think of the value. So From that, we have a stratified random sample. So that is number 2. Maybe big enough, and it's a stratified random sample. And as a result, it should be representative. So we then allocated them out to our 4 groups, and there are 3 trial periods, of which 1 and 2, well, 2 is underway at the moment. 1 we've done, I'm going to talk about, and 3 will be next. Yeah, it'll be next winter for them. So still trying to get control of my time zones. And this is where it all started to go horribly wrong, which is what I talked about last time. So we used a supplier here whose name I should have blanked out, really, but anyway. The research team installed a meter clamp which they claimed was 30 minutes. It wasn't, it was 20 minutes, and then they interpolated it. And then we also did household surveys in order to get information about the households. And this is what started to happen. So we started recruiting back in May 2015, I think it was. If it's green, we've got all the data we should have for the day, but close to. If it's red, we haven't. If it's white, we've got no data at all. Okay, so we started recruiting up there. We were continuing to recruit, and as you can see, sometime in August, we got polls. We'd already lost people. We had no data at all for January, the first week of January. I think they all went on holiday or something. And by here, we decided this was a really bad idea. And essentially, they just all died. So we got, the most of them had died by 30 days. Oh, great, really good. Spent all that money recruiting all those households, and we can't measure them. So that was what I said when I came before. Now we fixed it. And would you believe that the original company, whose name I should have deleted, put themselves into liquidation to avoid being sued, and then came back 2 weeks later with a new firm, the same people, and said, we can provide you with a new service. So we said, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're going to go somewhere else. That's where we went. So this is a company that's based in the UK. It's quite a small startup. And instead of the kind of clunky system we had before, it really works really nicely. They push data out to AWS, to Amazon for us, and we pull it off there. And this has 2 advantages to us. First, it's reliable. It stays up and it's still working. It's also exactly 15-minute data. It's not any kind of interpolation. And we're also getting 10-second sample watt data as well. So we've got power, and we weren't getting that before. So this is brilliant. It is generating, however, rather a lot of data. Such is life. Not as much as CERN, as I keep telling them. So, and we've still got the 20-minute household surveys. We don't have everybody. This is inevitable. So we recruited, what I say, 4,300 roughly. We're getting about an 80% response rate for survey data. It creeps up every time we do something. We do a bit more survey, but there's some asymptotes as well. And that's fairly normal. So the control group, we do these updates every year. And for the trial groups, not only do we do that, but we do stuff to them as well. And part of the interventions is the survey, to kind of push it together. And we also do time use surveys, which I won't go into in any detail particularly, but that we have used them to understand what the flow of activities that people engage in during the day is. So what I want to talk about, apart from the fact that, look at that pretty green graph. So we did a whole lot of recruitment. Most of them are still with us. 1 or 2 dropped out, 1 or 2 have come back. We've lost, well, I'll show you in a minute. And then we did a bit of a boost here. And you can see that if I show you this one. So we were recruiting all the way through here. These are the 4 different groups. The red one's the control group, actually. That was Christmas, so you didn't do any recruitment there. It just drifts down, as you'd expect, normal kind of attrition, a bit more recruitment, bit more recruitment. Basically, we're trying to keep it up there, so we've got close to 1,000 in each group as we can. And eventually, you run out of money, and you know at some point it's going to keep just tail off. Perfectly normal stuff. So there's 3 kinds of results that I want to show you in different levels of detail. One about recruitment, because this is quite crucial to that claim I made about generalization. Okay? And then I want to talk about the first trial, and then I want to talk about the way we're using this to think about local demand modeling, okay, which is something that we want to do a bit more of here. Okay? So the first thing that we've done is to compare our data, which is the red, with well, it's actually a national high-quality academic survey for the same area, okay? Collected in exactly the same way, recruiting households, but into a general-purpose social survey. Okay? And you can see, for example, that we have under-recruited younger people, and also under-recruited much older people. And one of the reasons for that is that we have preferred, been very difficult to recruit people in flats because we need to put something on the meter. And attaching a offer, very often in the UK, the meters are not in the flat. They're sort of somewhere over there, and you can't identify which belongs to which necessarily, and the people don't know. Also, with a lot of flats in the UK, there's first door, general entrance door, and then obviously the next door for the flat itself. It's quite difficult to get through the first door if you don't know who you're trying to contact for the next one. Okay, so access into lots of flats is actually quite difficult. The flip side is there's particular groups of people here, here, and also here, single persons, who are underrepresented in our survey, or represented in our sample. So I was slightly concerned about that, but then the lines company said, well, that doesn't matter too much because that lot churn a lot, and they're low users. So actually, it's these that we care about. So if we're trying to make generalizations from a policy perspective, that's quite important. But if your results user only cares about certain groups, you can be a little bit more relaxed about it. And we've done the same sort of tests for a whole range of other variables. This one's income distribution. So this one actually looks fairly okay. And you will notice I have introduced some little things called error bars. Yeah. These are 95% confidence intervals, and they're going to be quite important. For those of you who are not statistically minded, essentially what it's telling you is that if we redid this study 100 times, 95 times out of 100, we would expect that value to be between those 2 points. So therefore, essentially, if you find 2 error bars that don't overlap, you've got a statistical difference. So bear that in mind. This one is the one that kind of surprised me. So the national survey put on the Scientific Society carried a battery of questions about essentially about pro-environmental behaviour. And I had expected the people who signed up for our study to be quite a lot higher. As you can see, they're not particularly. The median is slightly higher. There's a slightly higher distribution such that there's more people who are very high on the score. But overall, when you do more robust measurements and tests on this, there's no particularly strong difference. So there isn't really a selection effect going on, even though they knew they were signing up for some kind of energy project. Okay, this is also important for making claims about the general population. Okay, so on the basis of what I've just shown you, we're fairly confident that we've got a reasonably representative sample. So whatever we find here will be true of the general population of that part of the UK. Okay. It won't be true necessarily of London, because the population is very different, and then routines and so on are very different as well. So just taking some of the data then, what can we see immediately from some of the consumption data that we've got? So each day, and apologies for those of you who are colourblind, is a different colour. Here we have households where the response person, however defined, essentially the person that we contact to speak to, is in employment, where they're retired, or where they're neither of those two. So you can see quite clearly you've got an early morning breakfast sort of spike. We come down to lunchtime, and we go back up to the evening peak. So that mirrors what I was showing you earlier on. Okay. But then you have Saturday, and you have Sunday. Sunday's the red, Saturday's the purple. Then for retired people, it looks slightly different. Okay. So you've got Saturday, well, all the days look pretty much the same except Sunday. And then the others are essentially a mixture of those. Okay. But there's some things that kind of spring out from here. First of all, you want some solar citizens, and they're in here, because that's when their consumption is rather higher, relatively. But also, you might see in red there, that's Sunday. The Sunday evening has the highest peak of any day, and it's also slightly earlier than the other weekdays. Okay. Now, this is quite interesting and quite novel, because in the UK, at least, everybody assumed weekdays had the highest peaks from a consumer point of view, but they don't. And one of the reasons for that, from other work we've done using time use diaries, where you ask people to tell you what they're doing during the day, is they're getting ready for the working week. And this is particularly the case where you've got a high proportion of women in work, where a whole load of domestic activities that would have been spread through the working week are now done on Sunday evenings, or indeed pushed into evenings during weekdays. So there are social transitions going on in the UK, and I think here too, that are pushing those habits into different times of day, potentially causing problems. Okay. We also have because we asked in the survey, we know what kind of energy people tend to use for heating, and also for cooking as well. Now, this will be unusual for here because we have predominantly at the moment gas for heating and also for hot water, which is the green line. So most people in our survey are gas. There are a smaller number who use storage heaters, and they're usually incentivized through a tariff scheme to use it at night, that's the red ones, and also during the period in the evening as well. Usually a preheat, which is here, but then they'll turn it up themselves in the evening, which I think matches some of the intentional use of heat pumps that I think Michael has been looking at. And you see the same thing with the purple. So the purple is all sorts of other electricity, including heat pumps. Now, the UK heat pumps are used not just for heating, but also for hot water. And they're used to maintain hot water at a certain level, and that then generates the heating. So it's a secondary effect. It's not usually blown hot air. Okay, so you're heating up something which then heats up the mass in the building. Nevertheless, that follows a different pattern. So if these people, these few 18 of them, are in any way giving us a preview of what future heat pump users will be like in the UK, it's changing the shape again. Okay. But there's nothing here which is reducing the peak, is there? So the second thing I want to show you is what's happening or happened in the first of our trials. And we did two different things. The first thing we did was over a period of a few weeks, we focused on messages about particular activities, week by week by week by week. Okay? So some of that was done through material such as this, which was sent, both as email, postal, or some combination. So we were testing out the media combinations. And one example of the week was about laundry. So this was, I think this was week 3 or week 4. And when you do the analysis over the whole 8-week period, essentially it made no difference at all. You cannot see a statistical significant difference between the control group and any of the groups who had any of this messaging arriving. Okay. There were perhaps 3 to 4% reductions, but we would have needed a sample size of 6,000 to have concluded that that was statistically significant, even if that actually was the case. Okay. So it has a very small effect, or in the work that we did anyway. The one I want to talk about particularly is a specific day. So this was effectively an event day where we were imagining a network situation where, let's say, in our case, gas turbines gone out. In your case, maybe you can't use hydro because the lakes are dry this week or whatever. So there's a weekday evening when you need people to use less for whatever reason. Okay? And rather like the other one, we used communications, essentially, one group, and then we added a price incentive. So it was going to get expensive. The idea was it was likely not expensive. What we actually did was if you can reduce your consumption compared to the previous 3 weeks, then you get a prize, £100 prize, something like that. And there was a certain threshold that they were trying to gain against. So this was some of the communication that we used. And I just want to show you, we emailed the ones who were the online group as well, and I'll come back to why that was interesting. So some things did happen in this example. And this is the 3 days. So the middle one's the event day. The top one's the day before, and this one's the day after. And if you look very carefully with binoculars, you can probably see that the day before, the blue one just pops up a little bit. So it was as if they were pre-meditated. They were just getting a bit in. On the day of the event, the red one pops up. Now that's the control group. So the others have depressed their consumption a little bit. Not a lot, but a bit. And they also, the blue pops up there again, as if just beforehand they'd shifted stuff a little bit. Okay, so there's some evidence of shifting that way, day before, and that way, so a few hours before. Then when we come to the day after, it kind of reverts back, as if they kind of bounce back, so you can kind of rebound. Okay, now when you look at that a bit more closely, we can see it. So this is just all that lovely data collapsed down just to means for those periods of time. So there at the top, you can see the blue ones who are kind of above the control group, so they're getting that consumption ahead. Here on the day, they come down below. Just beforehand, the blue one popped up just in front. And then after the event, which is just in this period here, those two pop back up again as if they'd saved up a bit of something. We're doing it here. Okay. So you can do various kinds of analyses with that. And the one that we've used just now is a regression type analysis, which I will attempt to explain. So we have three models. Look at the red one first. So that takes everybody who was being measured using the clamps, and we just see whether being in one of the groups compared to the control means that they use more or less compared to the control. So the positive coefficient this way means they use more. The negative coefficient, that one, that means they use less. Now, what this is telling you is that pre-peak, so this is that period before 4 o'clock, this lot, this group 3, used a bit more, which is what we saw. This lot, group 2, used a little bit less, but our confidence intervals are covering 0. We cannot conclude anything at all. So we have a point, what's called a point estimate. That one's positive. That's the mean effect. But because we've got so much variation and such a small group, and the effect is so small, we can't conclude anything statistically from that. Okay, so this is the key thing about confidence intervals. So model 2, the green one, we've added in whether or not they opened that portal email. So the ones who were in the online group received an email pre-warning. And that appeared to encourage people to use a bit more in the pre-peak period. But again, look at the error bars. Okay. The blue one is simply me including that pro-environmental score that we had that I talked about when we compared the two samples. The reason to do that is that it shows you here that people who have a high environmental score use less. Full stop, which is exactly what you'd expect, but there's no significant effect on the way they responded to the intervention. So people who are higher didn't use less or more compared to those who didn't. Okay? So it's, whilst we know that those people use less, it's not necessarily leading to any other increased changes. All right, and I'll just show you. Okay, so remember that. Why have we got such huge error bars there? And the reason is because once we start to include survey data, we've got fewer people because we haven't got complete coverage of the survey. Okay, so this is why it's quite crucial to get that survey data as close as you can to the completely measured sample. Otherwise, you're always going to have this reducing numbers problem when you use the survey data as well. Okay, so this is the same model, kind of, but it's the peak period. So in this case, we can see that for the intervention groups, we had a little negative coefficient, so that the mean, the point estimate is that they're using less. But again, we've got this problem with the error bars. Okay? So again, we can't conclude we've got any statistically significant effects, apart from the fact that those who have a high pro-environmental score just use less anyway, which is what we'd expected. Okay? So you might think, oh, that's all really disappointing, isn't it? Well, yes and no. It's a result, right? If a large company thinks it can do this kind of thing and have an effect and invest money to do so, they're wrong. They don't want to invest the money in that way. They want to invest the money in some other way. Okay? So it's not a problem. This is a positive result which can avoid some potential missed costs, misplaced costs. So just to summarize, and when you see write-ups of trials which got to the kind of meta-analysis stage and published kind of policy report stage, you'll see the number in bold. Group 3 increased their consumption by 5%. You won't see the numbers in red, which tell you that it could have been anywhere between -3 and +15. Okay? Uncertainty is crucial. Then in that period of the peak time, again, you wouldn't see the red ones. You just said, oh, -3, we've got a -3%, wow. Well, actually, it could have been anywhere between -11 and +5. That's the nature of statistics. It has to be there to really understand what's going on. The one thing that came out, which kind of a little chink of light here, is this bit. That using the time use survey data, the people who responded the most appeared to have not come home from work. So it wasn't that they were doing less in the house, they just hadn't bothered to come home. They probably went out to eat, although so we had a whole slew of people who, in this trial group, who were doing work or shopping or whatever, and then where the rest of them came home, they went out for dinner, or they went to sort of movies or whatever, which is actually quite a well-known response in Australia to peak periods of heat demand, or cooling demand, sorry, to use public resources like shopping malls, for example, to cool. I hadn't expected it in the UK, but there you go. And then afterwards, again, we see this bounce-back effect. And yet again, if you actually quoted the confidence intervals, then you probably wouldn't. You conclude that nothing really has happened. However, there are signs, nevertheless, and our goal with the iterations of the trials is to, if you like, improve the messaging, improve the incentives, rethink the trials to see if we can squeeze out some more. Or if we can't, then we've learned that essentially we're going to have to go about this in completely different ways. Okay. So I want to just switch a little bit, because you've seen a kind of this sort of level analysis. So that's the whole of our population area, and you've seen a profile which represents the whole of the population area, all the people together, okay? Which is useful and interesting and all the rest of it. But for lines companies, they want to know actually where is that on the ground? Where doesn't it not look like that on the ground? And where might it be changeable on the ground? Okay, so rather than that picture, what they really want is a picture that looks a bit like this. So they want to know the profile, all those little parts of Southampton. And they want to do that so that they can decide here, they probably need to dig up the road, because the kinds of people who live there aren't going to be able to shift their consumption around. So they're going to have to reinforce the network. But over here, it looks like there's the kind of people with profiles that they can instead incentivize in some way, and it'll be cheaper. Okay, so we need a model which enables variation spatially. Okay. So that's the other part of the work that we're doing, is to combine the UK census data from 2011 with our survey and monitoring data to effectively create a synthetic electricity census. So this is at what we call an output area level, which is roughly, I think, similar to a mesh block here. And for Southampton, you can see, don't worry about what it is, but this is picking out different OAs in Southampton. So this is the level of scale. So in our case, a lines company is very interested in being able to model that. They'd really want to be able to get down a bit further, but that's about the best we can do. Okay. So I can't explain in detail how we do this, but I won't do that now. We'll do a whole other seminar. But essentially, when we combine those sorts of data, we've done it for the whole of Southampton. I just picked out two output areas which are distinctly different, because one of them has got nobody who lives in a single person household. Okay, that's the top one. So there's 85 households, and there's nobody who's a single person household. And in the second one, I think we might have reversed accidentally, we've got virtually all the single person households. But this one, in fact, is all the single person households, and that one is the other one. So you have to imagine it's flipped. So what we've got here is the total modelled consumption on a given day, that day, Sunday, the 8th of January, 2017. And this one is mostly red because it's mostly made up of single person households. Okay. And this one is all different colours because there's lots of different kinds of households there. And you can see the contribution to the overall demand made by the different kinds of households. Okay. You don't see any single person households there because there aren't any. So there's a few things to notice about this approach to modelling. Okay, the first one is, what on earth is that? Look, we don't have very many single person households. We appear to have a few who have done something strange on Sunday, the 8th of January, and as a result, it gets multiplied up in the model. So you get this strange spike. So there's no way on earth that I would claim that's an accurate representation of what happened here in that place on the 8th of January, because what we've done is we've taken all those people, and in nearly all single person households from across Hampshire, our study region, and we've put them in there. And we've reweighted them so they match the census characteristics on other kinds of things, like income, number of card, whether they're employed. However, what this lets you do is say, well, okay, if single people were more responsive in certain ways, how would that be shifted? If two-person households or those with two children are more responsive in certain kinds of ways, how would that shift things around? What would it mean in the local area for that network if we could introduce an intervention? Because it will be effectively different here compared to there because of the different kinds of people that live there. Okay. Even if they responded in the same way, a single person here responded in the same way to a single person there, because of the different social makeup of the areas, you'll get a different response, different overall effect. And it's the overall effect that the lines companies care about. Okay, so they can use this, in fact they are using this, they're pushing this sort of information into a network level model which has a cost model built into it. And as a result, they're developing a network investment model for Southampton on the back of it. And this is the kind of work that I'm interested in doing here, and we'll be using some data of this kind to do this over the next year and a half or so. Okay. So what have we learned so far, just to pull all those threads together? Well, I've got some practical stuff for you. The original meter clamps were both used broadband, fixed broadband, and they used mobile signal. Now, in the UK, we have holes in our 3G signal, so we have stuff that doesn't get through, so the data just disappears. So we have patchy coverage. We also have an even more interesting problem, which is that when you've got a gadget that is actually visible to a person and uses one of the power points, when it comes to Christmas and they want to plug everything in, they'll pull it out. Luckily, the gadget that we've used stores up to 30 days worth of data. So sometime in the middle of January, when we rang them up and said, please, would you back in again, the data then flowed back. So you need some sort of resilience in your system to cope with the fact that people will pull out your kit if it's accessible in any shape or form. Which is why I just love the smart meter data idea, because they can't pull out the smart meter. As long as you can get access to data, all of that problem just goes away. Okay? It's incredibly important that you record what you're doing to the data as it flows through. And we use R, we use Markdown, we use GitHub to do all of those things. And that's particularly important where you've got people moving through a research project. You need to pick up the threads from what happened before. Okay? And I'll come back to that's also relevant to something on this side. I'll come back to that. You don't have to do all your work on big data. You can do it on little bits of samples of data, and when you're confident that it works, then do it on the big data. Sometimes you don't even need to do that. You can just sample it. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. You don't have to do data on the whole year. You can do sampling, you can take particular weeks or whatever. Okay, and it really does reduce the time. However, we have found that we can use commodity hardware. But on the other hand, we have also found that we struggle in certain things. Don't, whatever you do, aggregate your data. Keep it in the form you get it in. Because if you aggregate it, you lose the variation. And if you lose the variation, you lose actually what's quite important to some of the lines companies, which is the total range of things that you're going to get. So a half-hourly average tells them much less usefully than a 15-minute, because there's more variation there. And as you go down the scale, so you get increased variation as well. So there's a trade-off between efficiency of data collection and storage and the kind of utility of information. But I would always say don't suppress what you've got. Don't aggregate it unless that's just a processing and you keep the original stuff. Okay. Don't impute anything unless you flag it. Don't fill in a hole. Make a new variable which is imputed. Okay. Leave the original data as it was, because somebody will disagree with your imputation method at some point and you'll want to change that data. So you keep the original data, you record what you did, the provenance and the method you used to impute it. You can always make a new version of the original data, the original variable. Similarly, never delete anything either. And the one problem we have had, which we've had to use high-performance computing for, is to find duplicate records. Because of this resilience issue, we've got data arriving which is up to 30 days old. We've got to have almost 3 months worth of data in memory at one time to find if there's a duplicate. And that was quite a processing intensive task. So my laptop can't cope with that. So we've had to use some of the HPC stuff that we have at Southampton. Okay, so practical things. From a research point of view, it's hard. It's really difficult to get people to shift what they do. And one of the reasons for that is there's so much variation between the same kinds of people in the way they live their lives. And routines vary even more than you might expect, and you can see that in the consumption data as well. Okay, so if you have any questions, I'll be here for another 18 months.
And in fact, for another 13 minutes.
Yes,
so,
well, that too.
any questions?
What do SSE compare the results to like?
They were particularly interested in the baseline data, so they hadn't seen any, but they have no information at all on profiles, consumption profiles, because they simply don't measure it. They also don't own the customer, so this is the lines company. They have no information about the consumers either. So they were very interested to see even the baseline consumption data that we were showing them. They were very interested in the amount of effort it was taking to shift people's behaviour around. And they were very interested, because they were mostly economists, in the fact that offering people money made no difference. Because price was seen as the lever. And when we demonstrated in a number of different ways how routinized and contingent on the flow of activities people's lives are, you can only cook after you've got home, after you've collected the kids, and then before, and the laundry needs doing because they need the shirt in the morning, or whatever it is. They started to understand why price wasn't necessarily going to work, and why actually the people who could most afford the price were probably the ones that didn't need to shift.
Then comes the compare against in Scotland. I don't know if it's still doing it. I work for that system in Scotland. In Scotland, there was a ban. I don't know if it's still doing it to roll out smart meters across the country, and that's obviously good. But I wonder if there's a plan to compare that significantly a lot of data.
Yeah.
And it's very, very different. I would expect everybody to see what you presented first. Are there any plans to utilise that data more in that?
Yes. So I'm also part of a separate project, which is trying to set up a representative sample, if you like, of UK households, including Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, England, and to collect, with their consent, smart meter data in perpetuity from that sample. And we would also know the kinds of things that we know about these households through a survey process. So we're doing that now so that we're ready to start collecting the smart meter data from the central hub that's in the UK is collecting, but is responsible for, as a gateway to that data, because that will be live, roughly speaking, in June or July this year. However, the coverage of smart meters is still sufficiently low that we have to worry about whether we can adequately represent the population of households, because at the moment it's only 20%. It's a UK-wide program, but it's always another 2 years. It's looking back through all sorts of reasons. Yeah, we exactly plan to do that.
Yes, I guess because we always get asked, or one of the questions people ask us is, how much flexibility do you actually need? And in your data, you have the error bars. Does that mean you have some people that were being very flexible?
Yeah.
And does that mean we target them if that's all we need?
Yeah, that could well be the case. So we have isolated those who appear to have responded the most, and we're starting to do work on trying to work out if there's any common attributes that you could actually use to target. And what we've done so far suggests it's quite tricky, because, and it kind of relates to something that the UK Energy Department did some while ago, which was a detailed study of about 100 gas users. And they concluded that what made a heavy gas user was that they were a heavy gas user. But they could find very few, if any, common attributes. You could always say, well, you didn't look for enough. But if the easy things don't come out, those are the easy things that all a company can use to target. Unless there's some attributes of the profiles themselves which are indicators. Because the smart meter data would then allow you to pinpoint any household, essentially for free, which had that combination of profile shapes or whatever it is.
So just on that, sorry, somebody else had their hand up, but I just wanted to follow up on that. So when they are looking for attributes, are they just looking at demographic attributes, or are they looking at also what is the physical arrangement of the house, the kinds of appliances, and the interaction between behaviour and appliances?
They had appliance data, and they had interviewed households about their habits and routines. But I think they had only really use the kind of surface level attributes. And quite a lot of what they did was to attempt to cluster people beforehand, which is a bit pointless when you've got about 100 qualitative interviews. But they'd attempted to devise these clusters of sort of like heavy, medium, low, and then there was some other attribute going this way, so they had a nice box grid. And then thought that those would back onto heavy usage patterns, and they found that it didn't. So it's, as I said, it's possible that more work could elucidate things, but
that connects to your third aggregate to really point really, doesn't it?
yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. But also the work that I've done with water consumption just leads me down the same path. We had dwellings which are exactly, these were low carbon dwellings, newly built. They were identical, and they had been kitted out with the same appliances. They were brand new. People moved in. Similar kinds of people because they had the same number of bedrooms. Consumption was good like this.
The first graph had a large bar or a large portion where it was just unknown. Because it's unknown.
Unknown. Which
It was like a low, it was very first.
way back.
Yeah. Oh, like the employment status. No. It was like a low profile. I don't know if it's your data or.
Oh, was it all the others? So the ones who weren't employed?
Like an aggregate thing.
Oh, sorry. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Right. Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah, I can explain what's in it because I did the analysis to get there. We could get all the way back. Oh, you shouldn't have seen that name of it. They didn't end up getting taken to court. I'll tell you that. So. We just sent somebody around with a baseball bat. No. Come on. Okay, so this one. Yeah. So that one. This was a consequence of the way they did the measurement. So in this particular study, which actually was brilliant, it's very similar to Green Grid. They attempted to put a monitor on every single circuit in a fuse box. They attempted to then also label what was connected to the circuits and also what was connected to particular plugs on those circuits, like something like that. But they couldn't allow for chaining. So a bank of sockets plug, then had a printer and a PC and a light and the fridge, and they couldn't classify that within the circuit. So it just gets lumped down here. So this stuff is kind of mostly appliances.
Yeah. Really. I was going to say, obviously, it goes up. It seemed like it's appliance.
Then have you found any rebound peak due to the incentive they are providing during the peak period or after?
So the only thing that we have seen is this little, almost a pre-bound of the day before and the few hours before, and then a little bit afterwards. But again, they're so small. And I think that's what they are, because you see those sorts of effects in other studies as well. But they're just so small that, unfortunately, with the sample sizes we've got and the size of them, and we can't make robust claims about them. And this is, I think, this is quite well known that it could actually make things slightly worse. If you've got a threshold effect up to here, then it actually generates a mini peak here, which catches the generators out even worse than if you haven't actually moved it at all, because it synchronizes everybody.
Yeah.
Whereas this, actually, quite interestingly, when you look at time use survey, and I think I might talk about this in another seminar sometime in the spring. No, later in the year. That the commute time in the UK has elongated here because of further travelling to work being further, and that causes a random coming home time, which spreads out the start of cooking and showering and laundry and whatever. So it actually appears to have taken the intensity that was here and kind of smeared it slightly. And your threshold causes the exact opposite to happen. It means everybody does something right then. It's the classic halfway through the football cup final, everybody puts the tea in the kettle on. You might think that's a myth, but actually we can see that in the national grid data in the UK. It's there. Yeah.
You can work it here.
Yeah, well, quite. Yeah.
I would like to know how did you measure the data? I mean, did I understand correctly that you had some sort of smart meter clamps?
Yes.
You put 3 clamps into the fuse box?
We have only put one in, and it goes. It's just a little clamp like that,
Yeah.
which is then attached to a little transmitter.
Yeah.
Transmitter goes to a box that's attached to the internet in the house, and it sends that back to us.
Okay. And the collected data was transferred via Wi-Fi?
Internally, no. They use some protocol, which is not Wi-Fi, but it's some sort of data transfer protocol, which they claim has extended distance range.
And how was it sent to you via internet?
Yes. So we rely on the household to have internet access,
Yeah.
and to allow us to plug the second bit, the hub,
Yeah.
into their router.
And then during the course of problem, you can have any sample houses without internet.
They got the GSM option,
Okay.
Yeah.
which then turned out to be patchy because the people who didn't have internet access lived in the countryside, where there's less.
So you supplied this metering
We
system?
supplied the kit, yeah. So that costs in the UK that's about £60 to buy, but we got it first, 2/3 that because we had a bulk order of several thousand.
Yeah, then you gave it to them, and then you took it back later.
Not yet.
Are
I'm
you-
going to no. I want to leave it there.
Okay.
Yeah. So in principle, the project is bounded, but we never committed to any end date as far as the participants are concerned.
Okay.
So at the end of the project, from a legal and program funding point of view, if SSE effectively give the households to Southampton, we can carry on. If they fall down an institutional crack for even 3 or 4 days, we've got to stop. So we need to line all that up in 2020. They do work here too. So I got one sent over. I'm trying to get another one sent over. So you could do this with households in New Zealand, and the company in the UK would simply give you access to the data. But there's all sorts of local options too. I know Janet and Michael have explored.
I think that was a question.
Well, I just wondered if you could quickly, well, the LED trial
Yeah.
you're talking about, have you done that at all? It's just
Yeah, they've just done it.
Because ECAT in New Zealand, our energy efficiency and conservation authority, started talking about a very similar thing in New Zealand, saying, oh, we can reduce peaks by converting to LED lights.
What kind of percentage do they think they might get?
Well, I think your study would.
I was hoping to be able to show you, but we've had several iterations over the last couple of weeks, and it's not clear exactly, but it's certainly having a result. It looked like it was having a big one. We've done some checking, and I'm not convinced that's actually true. It's looking more in the region of 10 to 15%. It was bigger than that, but I still even that is.
That's of the entire thing, or just the lighting?
It's the entire peak at that point in time, and it's been done in December and January in the dark in the UK, so the winter in the UK. They were fitted in October through November, and we could start to see that group diverging from the control quite early, particularly when the clocks changed at the end of October, obviously. Really nice. Oh, yes, we can see it. And then it's diverged, and now it's come back again as the evenings get lighter again. Hopefully, within a few weeks, I'll be able to show you something.
Okay, well, I'm going to choose privilege and ask one last question. And that is, if you ended up the pre-bound and the rebound, was that around the same amount as the reduction of the peak time that was being funded? But if you can't answer it off the top of your head.
No, well, you can add up the numbers right at the end of the slideshow. Hang on.
Oh.
If we whiz all the way down to nearly there, that one. So you had, I think the answer is no.
I was interested to know if they generally were using more of these.
You got plus Well, let's imagine you had. No, you don't. He doesn't. But then, if you know, the error bars are such that.
Yeah.
How would you add that up? You could do a you know, maximum plus and maximum minus or something.
Okay. Well.
Okay. And,
Yes.
and can I?
Yes.
My privilege is to say that this data will be publicly available at the end of the project in anonymised form. So any of you can repeat our analysis, check it, make sure we did it right, come to a different conclusion. But I'm afraid you won't be able to do it till 2020.
Okay, Peter, well, thanks so much.
No problem.
Absolutely fascinating. So good to hear the good news story after the bad news
Yes.
story of 3 years ago. If any of you want to follow up with Ben, he's based here at the centre, and so you can track him down.
Yep.
And I'd like to thank him very much.